So we continue our study of Brachos Daf Zayin. And the Gemara says as follows. We should be grateful. Omer Rabbi Elazar, Omer Lama Kodesh Baruch Hu Yisrael, De'u kama tzedakos osisi imochem shelo ka'asti b'mei bilam harasha. Rabbi Elazar said, God said to the Jewish people, know how much right kindness I did with you, that I never expressed anger during the days of Bilam, the wicked Bilam. She'il mole ka'asti, for if I had been angry, lo nishtar misoneim shel Yisrael saridu polit, the catastrophe for the Jewish people would have been complete. V'hainu deka'amar le Bilam lebolok, mo ekov lo kabol kel, umo ezom lo zo'am Hashem. How could I curse what God has not cursed, and how can I express anger against the one whom God has not expressed anger against? Malamed shekol osam hayomim lo zoam. This teaches us that all of these days God did not express anger. And thus, as we discussed in the previous session, that the anger of Hashem is a natural part of existence, is part of the creative process, and that Bilam would identify that with nefarious and malicious intent to take out of context that moment of anger, and thus the survival of the Jewish people is miraculous even in the context of the natural world. The Gemara continues, V'kama zamo rega. And how much is God's anger? Rega, it's a moment. V'kama rega, how much is a moment? Rabbi Ovin v'intema Rabbi Avina. Rabbi Ovin said, and if you will, Rabbi Avina said, Rega kememre, a moment is as long as it takes to say the word rega. And I wanted to explain the association between this idea of the moment of anger and the idea of speaking that moment, speaking that anger. What is the relationship between speech and anger? And we explained that the Gemara goes on to give a scriptural source for this idea. Uminolon derega ratach. How do we know that God's anger is for a moment? Shenemar, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, the verse in Psalms 30 says, Ki rega be'apo chayim birtzono. For his anger is a moment in his anger. Chayim birtzono, life is by his will. And if you will, from Yeshayahu Chavav, from Isaiah 26, Chavi kimat rega, hide for but a moment, ad yavor zam, until the anger passes. But going back to the verse in Tehillim, the verse in Psalms, Ki rega be'apo chayim birtzono, a moment of his anger, life is by his will. This explains, again, reinforces this theme, that God's anger is not a departure from God's goodness, but it's a part of God's goodness. That is, the moment of his anger is part of the way in which, by his will, he brings forth life. And this, of course, explains what the association is with the moment of anger and the idea of speaking that moment, the amount of time it takes to speak, rega. The Torah says that the Torah describes creation as Vayomer Elokim, God speaking. What is the relationship between creation and speaking? And we can understand this, perhaps, by reflecting on our own creative process. I could see God or have insight into the divine reality by understanding the human reality. What is speech? Speech is taking an idea, an inclination, a ratzon, a desire, and then expressing that into words, which means that a person has to turn away from the intensity of the experience of their desire and find the right words with which to express it. In fact, the words themselves when a person experiences something as a desire, it's experienced in a wholeness. There's a complete immersion in the desire. But in the speaking of it, one has to express only one can only express one word at a time. And here we have this theme of channeling and expressing this kind of discipline. And there is a harsh element to it wherein one has to withhold the experience of the will, of the ratzon, of the desire, and instead to focus on channeling that into the specific words. But this is not a departure from creation. This is part of Chayim B'Ritzono. This is part of God bringing forth life by His will. Similarly, in the creation of music, you would, let's say, in creating rhythm, rhythm is the interval of silence and sound. And so silence is part of expressing an idea through sound. And whereas, going back to Bilam, identifying only the silence out of context, focusing only on the moment of silence, you don't experience the goodness that's present, the theme that's present, the idea that's being expressed. All you have is the silence. And obviously that's not correct to isolate that moment of silence, that moment of withholding the musical expression on its own, even though withholding musical expression is part of expressing music. And this also is a so this is the idea of speaking as a creative, as the Chayim B'Ritzono, as the bringing forth life in creation, but at the same time, the gevura, the withholding, and the silence has an aspect of harshness to it, because one is that comes from the Kabbalistic worldview that puts all of the different attributes into two columns: the side of chesed, the side of expression and generative and expanding, versus gevura, which is silence, withholding, disciplining, and channeling. Anger goes into that column of fits with that column of silence and withholding and channeling and discipline and harshness. And so here the Gemara puts this rega, this moment of divine anger, into the greater context that Bilam wanted to take it out from, and to help us understand that this is part of the creative process. And even though that's the first pasuk, and the second verse from Yeshayahu 26 acknowledges that in that moment of silence, of withholding, of harshness, that it can be a scary time. It can be frustrating to try and find the right words. Or it can be frustrating when listening to those words or trying to express oneself, that within that process there could be a sense of frustration. However, chavi kimat rega, just hide for that moment. Stay still and be patient during that time until the anger passes, and then you'll come to the light, you'll come to the creation, you'll come to experience the fullness of the message.